Our new topic is photosynthesis. In order to talk about photosynthesis, we have to reference two separate vocabulary terms here, autotroph and heterotroph. Troph is a portion of a word that simply means food or nutrition. And so an autotroph, also known as a producer, is an organism that can create its own nutrition. In other words, think about a plant and its ability to go through photosynthesis. A heterotroph is an organism that must consume, like ourselves, nutrition so that it has to use producers, or at least it has to eat something that ate a producer, but ultimately all of the energy that heterotrophs take in can be traced back to that of the autotroph. In order to talk about photosynthesis, you have to talk about light, because ultimately that's where all of our energy comes from, the sunlight. Light travels in waves, and we tend to think about these waves in terms of colors. So of course you're all familiar with the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Each of those different colors, although traveling in waves, each have their own different wavelength. So light that results in the color red would have one wavelength, and orange would have a different one, yellow a separate wavelength, etc. Once light hits something, we see it as having a particular color because of what is either reflected or absorbed. So for instance, if you're wearing a blue shirt, it is because all the different wavelengths of light are hitting that shirt, and the blue is being reflected. And when it's reflected, it's being reflected into our eyes, and therefore we see it as blue. All the other wavelengths, the red, the orange, the yellow, the green, the indigo, and the violet, are being absorbed by that blue shirt. Think about this in relation to plants and their ability to go through photosynthesis. Plants, of course, are green. The ironic part here is that it's the green wavelengths of light that are actually being lost by the plant. They are not what's going through photosynthesis. It's all the other colors, the red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet, that are part of the photosynthetic process. Here is a representation of those different wavelengths. You can see that there are wavelengths of light beyond our ability to see: ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma ray, radio waves, microwaves, infrared. We only see in this little narrow spectrum right here, but it does provide us with those different colors. You can see red wavelengths are the bigger wavelengths, and as you work your way down to the other end, we get smaller and smaller wavelengths. Overall, the equation for photosynthesis is represented here. On the left side of this leaf, you can see everything that has to enter the plant or go into this chemical reaction. Sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water are all needed by a plant, and then ultimately they're going to produce as a waste product oxygen, but most importantly glucose or sugar, which is represented here, and all that is represented by the equation above. Please always keep this sort of umbrella idea in mind. We'll get into more details about this whole situation, but if you can keep the big picture of sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water in, oxygen and sugar out, you're going to be in good shape. Photosynthesis within a plant takes place specifically within the chloroplasts within the plant cells. And you can see here a picture of a chloroplast, and specifically some structures that are inside the chloroplast. Most notably, there are the thylakoids. These are these disc-shaped structures that you see here, and then you can see that they form sort of towers or stacks, and each of those stacks are known as granum. In between all of the stacks, in between the thylakoids, you have the stroma. And the reason that we bring up the stroma and the thylakoids is because although photosynthesis is a chemical reaction, it's actually a couple of separate chemical reactions put together. Some of those reactions take place within the thylakoids, and some of those reactions take place between the thylakoids, which is the stroma. This gives you an overall representation of photosynthesis. You can see there is a lot going on here. We're going to go through specifically the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions of photosynthesis. But again, just keep in mind the big picture. Light, water, and carbon dioxide in, oxygen and sugar out. Here, as I said, we can divide the whole photosynthetic process up into two main segments. There are the light-dependent reactions, and specifically they take place within the thylakoids of the chloroplasts, and there are the light-independent reactions, which take place within the stroma. Mostly what I want you to understand here is what goes in and what comes out of each of these portions of photosynthesis. The light-dependent reactions, as the name implies, depend on the presence of light. So light goes into the light-dependent reactions. But what also goes in is water. Of course, plants suck up water through their roots, and so we've got water and we've got light. They go into the light-dependent reactions, and there are three products that come out. One of those products would be the oxygen. We all know that plants give off oxygen, and this happens to be why. Because during the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis, water is actually broken down, and the oxygen is given off by the plant. What the plant produces that it actually wants, though, are two energy molecules. Now, this is important. ATP and NADPH have taken in high energy electrons. They represent the whole point here, which is the transfer of energy in the form of light to energy in the form of a chemical. So the energy was part of the light. The energy is now in chemical form, which is really the whole goal of photosynthesis. The key here, though, is that ATP and NADPH, although they are chemical energy, are only short term. They can't last long term. They can't be stored. And so this is not an end point, but merely a middle point. The ATP and the NADPH are then going to go on to the light-independent reactions, along with the other raw ingredient that a plant takes in, which is carbon dioxide. And so between the carbon dioxide, the ATP, and the NADPH, sugar is going to be formed, C6H12O6. And that is chemical energy that can be stored for a long period of time. Now this is where things get a little bit complicated. We're going to look specifically at the first portion of photosynthesis called the light-dependent reactions. And specifically, there is chlorophyll, known as photosystem II, that occupies the chloroplasts, and there's chlorophyll known as photosystem I, which occupies the chloroplasts, and some specific chemical reactions that take place here. First of all, we're going to travel with the sunlight, and it's going to hit the plant, and it's going to hit chlorophyll that is photosystem II. And the energy that is taken in by the plant in photosystem II is going to be used for a couple of things. Number one, here's water. And water is going to be broken apart into its two H's and one O. And here's the oxygen. And remember, we just got done saying that the oxygen is going to be given off. What also happens is that the sunlight, the energy from the sunlight, energizes two electrons and causes them to leave photosystem II because of their high energy. So there are two of these electrons. And they bounce around and give off some energy and ultimately end up as part of photosystem I. During that time, what you have with the energy that was being given off is the production of ATP. So ATP is one of those short-term, high-energy molecules. At the same time that sunlight is hitting photosystem II, sunlight is also hitting the chlorophyll of photosystem I, causing again two electrons to jump to a higher energy level and bounce around down an electron transport chain and they become part of NADP+, which joins with some of the hydrogen ions that were released from the water molecule being destroyed and become a molecule of chemical energy called NADPH. So we end up with the ATP that we're supposed to end up with at the end of the light-dependent reactions, along with the NADPH, two high-energy molecules, but that are short-term energy only. One last thing to look back at here is the electrons themselves. You can imagine if sunlight is constantly hitting photosystem 2 and causing that chlorophyll to lose 2 electrons, then eventually isn't photosystem 2 going to run out of electrons? The answer is no. Why? Because when the water is broken apart and the oxygen is released, notice that these 2 blue dots here are hydrogen ions. They're 2 H pluses. In other words, they have each given up or lost their 1 electron. So if each of those 2 gives up their electron, they give it up to photosystem 2. Even though photosystem 2 lost 2 electrons, they're going to be restocked by the electrons from the hydrogen atoms of the water molecule. And of course, photosystem 1 is always losing 2 electrons also, but they're being restocked by the electrons from photosystem 2. So in the end of all that, ADP and NADP+ are both high-energy electron acceptors. They take on those electrons that have been energized, and they become ATP and NADPH. So by the end of the light-dependent reactions, the plant has taken in light and water and produced ATP, NADPH, and O2. At this point, we have to deal with the idea of gas exchange, something that occurs within us. We take in oxygen and we give off carbon dioxide. Well, plants do the same thing, but in reverse. They take in carbon dioxide, but give off oxygen, and they do so within structures that are referred to as stomata. You're looking here at the cross-section of a leaf, and you can see openings here. Those openings are the stomata, and you can see the red cells on either side of the stomata, and those are known as guard cells. So those guard cells have the ability to open and close when gas exchange needs to take place. And if we look at this picture, just a different representation, you're now looking at the flat side of a leaf. You can see that slit or opening right there is the stomata, and these 2 purplish colored cells along the side are the guard cells. Finally, we have the second half of photosynthesis, which would be the light-independent reactions. In other words, they don't require light to occur. But what they do require is the ATP, the NADPH, both from the light-dependent reactions, and the CO2 being brought in through the stomata due to gas exchange. So you can see CO2 is necessary. You can see ATP is necessary. You can see NADPH is necessary. And there is this cyclical set of chemical reactions that is taking place that is known as the Calvin cycle, which ultimately in the end produces what we are after all along, which is a molecule of sugar.